Tēnā koutou katoa. I'll just open us with a karakia. Me karakia tātou. Tīkina atu I tua whakarere, I te ao kōhatu, ngā mōhiotanga o rātou mā. Hei kawe ia tātou I roto I te ao tūroa. Kua tākoto ke te whāriki I rarangahia e rātou. Wānangahia tuakina kia tau. Rangahaua kia maumahara. Manakohia kia whiwhi ai. Te mātauranga Māori motuhake. Haumie, huie, tāki. Ka pai. Tēnā koutou katoa. I'm so happy to have everyone here. Between myself and Lisa, we'll probably just alternate with questions, and I'll jump straight in. And just ask a lovely broad one about your memories of the development of TENZ, why it was established, how it came about, and who was involved.
So this is where there's a long pause and everyone's polite, waiting for someone else.
Yeah.
Generally.
I'll start, then everybody else can tell me I've got it wrong. But I think, it really began in 92 when we did the policy papers, and the government was wanting some framework around what would technology education be like. And Cliff and Welby, remember those days, going around the country and talking to people. And one of the key things is there were a number of organisations, and unless you had an organisation that could bring people together and from diverse groups, and with a common core, you're unable to get any change. And I think I've spoken about that before, but I think unless you had a place and an identity, then it was hard to get any system level change. So I guess that's where we started considering it right back when we looked at what would be the key characteristics of a new curriculum, which did not have a history of being delivered in the way in which we were trying to outline. So that's where I guess it went, and then there was the curriculum writing and trying to do that. But Cliff will remember me fronting up, I think, in Palmerston North of all places, at the end of 92, I think, Cliff, to a graphic and design teachers technology, whatever the title was. But I think that was really, and to see the energy that was there at the time, realised you had to do something to bring people together. So if I can speak about what happened before we even had a curriculum, that was probably one of the key memories for me, was being on a road trip for about 6 months, trying to bring teachers, other organisations and government together around a new vision. Would that be fair, Welby? I think that was sort of probably, and you were at some of those events as well, that, unless we did something different, we were going to stay at the status quo was going to remain.
Yeah, I'm actually glad you kicked in with that, because actually everything has roots, including TENZ. And so I remember I'd come up from Taihape and I'd been unemployed, and I ended up teaching woodwork at Western Springs in the year that it was 1986, school certificate workshop technology arrived. And it was part of something that was bubbling through New Zealand education. It was in the science curriculum, going, who owns technology? But the woodwork and metalwork, what were called had a history of being manual trade areas, were getting irritated by the fact that there was this idea that you were not good enough to educate people to go on to university. And so this shift was coming already. And it was 1986, school certificate introduced a thing called workshop technology, which meant that people in those curricular areas could actually start teaching a subject associated with materials and design and social context. And that was radical. And so I ended up in a workshop in a school that was one of those early schools to adopt that. And it was wonderful. It was wonderful because it said, instead of something craft and skills being reduced to making formula physical, it was asking people to think. And so there was this bubbling thought coming through, and I remember at Auckland College of Education, there were people like Robin Welsh who were questioning questioning what could design be? What could design be? Not applied frou-frou on some templated, box. What could it be if somebody thought with materials? And so there was this move forward, and it gathered momentum so some of it had come from science, and some of it had come, strangely enough, from the dirty old woodwork shop at the back of the school near the prefabs. And this thinking was surfacing. We now understand it as embodied thought, of thought through making. And so I was lucky to have landed in a place at a wonderful time when there were a group of people who didn't realize they were radicals, and that technology, which has been seen as in areas that had been seen as the poor excuse for not quite flash enough to be science, or not quite sure who the hell they were, started forming itself out of a context, out of a New Zealand context. And although there were anxious attempts to go and look overseas to see what they were doing, what we really did was we understood that we lived in a nation called Aotearoa New Zealand that had a context that was different to other people. And we had to try and grow something that was going to work for our country, not map something over that we could get from other countries. So I remember that time as very fertile. And I remember the company of wonderful thinkers who were all at the vanguard going, how did we find our way here? But recognizing that for a future to work, we had to dissolve ideas of status and hierarchy that had existed in some education, so that you could have people working inside innovation where there might not be a single known answer. There might be multiple elegant solutions. And so the shift from right and wrong to effectiveness happened. And that was wonderful. And it's something I'm deeply proud of to see still when it surfaces in New Zealand education.
Ka pai. Now, I noticed, David, did you want to contribute?
My understandings of the beginnings of not so much TENZ, but what was to become technology hangaro was, I was doing education television at the time, and we heard about this new curriculum coming, and so I took myself off to Alister Jones's office in Waikato. I think he was pretty surprised that somebody from television was beating down the door. And I asked him what it was all about. And for me, as someone on the outside, I just thought this was wonderful, because this was the curriculum of the real world. This was the curriculum where different processes came together and people came together and they leveraged one another. And ultimately it would have a profound influence on my working career, this curriculum. But at that time, I just thought this was pretty cool. This was really exciting. But it wasn't woodwork, and it wasn't cooking. It wasn't the things when I went to school and the little wooden seagull thing I made and all that. It wasn't that. It was this other stuff. It was much richer. Clearly, it needed a series of television programs. And so literally the next day, if Alister had been surprised to find somebody wanted to hear about this stuff from the outside world, a man called Steve Benson was even more surprised when I evidenced that I knew something about this thing called this yet to be released draft curriculum. And it was only at the end of the conversation I said, I was talking to Alister yesterday, and he breathed a huge sigh of relief that somehow the secrets of the ministry hadn't been breached or anything. And that's where we started. And then I got to meet the people that Alister and Welby have alluded to, including Welby. And I'll never forget, Alister said, go and see what Welby's doing. And he gave me lots of people to go and see, but Welby was one of the early ones. And I walked into a room with a number of students who were sitting with their work in front of me. They'd been given the instruction, a man is coming who wants to see your work. And the pride in the room was palpable. They had this arrogance of, I dare you to find something wrong with this. And their work was remarkable, because what had happened, what was happening in that room, and not just Welby's room, but the other people in that department, their students were all getting these external exam high marks and so on, but they'd been allowed to go deep. They'd been allowed to explore, and there wasn't a limit put on what they could do. But it was the human element that got me right from the start. Not just the stuff, but the actual way in which people were given the opportunity to bring their A game. And that's what really fired me in terms of what would follow, in terms of how I was able to work with Vicki and Alister and others to put together some material that might show people what the strange new curriculum was and what it wasn't.
That kind of makes me want to jump a little bit to our questions 3 and 4, just because it's all about the students, and that pride is just something absolutely fantastic. I mean, I think in terms of the changes that you were hoping for, and the way young people understood themselves as learners, problem solvers, and creators, are there other examples of seeing these aspirations realised?
Perhaps if I could jump in there. I had very similar experiences to Welby. Absolute frustration with what was going on, and when at the time I was teaching technical drawing and metalwork, but had the opportunity to start broadening out. And the issue I had was that it was taking kids nowhere, those subjects. So the introduction of design back in 1986, when the ministry finally took the lid off and allowed us to start playing in that design technology, workshop technology field, was certainly a breath of fresh air when it did come in. But the issue I had was there was no qualification aligned to it, particularly by the time you got through into what was Form 7 at the time, or the year 13 now. So there was no examination, so you could never take kids right through to the end of secondary schooling in that subject, in those subject areas. And a bit like Welby, I think Welby piggybacked on the back of art and enabled his kids to enter with design portfolios in art into both the bursary and the scholarship examination. I had the opportunity to do exactly the same. And it was that really that playing with kids, working with kids and enabling kids to be able to play with their ideas and bring them forward was the thing that excited me. And as soon as technology came along and provided that opportunity to not only allow the kids to be able to play and work with their ideas, but also get recognition for it in terms of qualification, that was the thing that really, for me, brought the excitement to both my teaching, but I saw the rewards coming through in terms of the kids and where they then went on to with their higher studies in those fields as well, which was great. And I've even got kids now that keep coming back to me. I was online the other night talking to one of my ex-students very early on, who's been working for Porsche and Audi, doing design innovations on their cars, and he still comes back and credits it back to the opportunities he had coming through schooling and the recognition that technology actually gave him a pathway into future study.
That's really interesting, Cliff, because the other day I was reading in 1944. William Thomas wrote this report in New Zealand arguing that you should not divide learning into vocation and academic, because he said a well-formed person a brilliantly formed person can design and build a house and go to the opera, and the fullness of them is not divided by a division between academic and technical. It's divided by quality of thought. And that thinking, so we had that built right, 1944, he argued that. We assumed we would never have a country that would go back and would split the world into academic and vocational. And history kind of rhymes, unfortunately. But but there is a greater way of understanding human skills, which says that very few of us, even anyone watching this, you could look around your world and you'd go, it's actually not made up as, it's not either academic or vocational. If I'm directing a film, I'm working with people who are bringing all kinds of thinking together in very sophisticated levels. And there was a class system around certain kinds of knowledge in New Zealand. And Cliff, you're absolutely right. We got kids who wanted to do engineering or architecture who said, oh, well, I can't follow these subjects because they won't go through. And yet, you know, when I left in the late 90s to come and work in universities, I work with industrial and product designers, engineers, spatial designers. They still talk about this stuff. When you say what mattered, what brought you here, they will come back down to the fact that I was able to think and apply my thinking to things that I made or could experiment with. And I was in a program where I could fail and recover from failure and have learnt more than if I just stuck to the system. You know, and that's what you want. And so now we have our universities are resourced by a strand that had been cut off, that couldn't get any further. And you know, I'd have to give credit to science too, because the technology inside science, there were people thinking about science as more than learning formula and repeating it or applying it in a 3-hour exam. They were understanding the application of science and technology to problem solving, and that brought a strand of people through. So now when we're working in sports science, you know, you've got people who are built together from relationships between bodies of knowledge. And one of the huge things that TENZ enabled, because it had kind of system nous. It kind of understood it. It was great to have vision and experience as teachers, but you had to find out how to get this to work. And you had to find out how to get it resourced. And you had to find out. So you needed those people who were not at the chalk face, who understood relationships with ministry and understood so that we didn't get a polarization from experience on the concrete and vision out here. We got these things talking across the bridge, and we had some very skilled people with that, and especially some of our researchers who were sitting inside universities at that time who could work across those platforms and make, essentially, I always think that TENZ, what it did was it helped us build community, an effective community.
I wonder if, Vicki, do you want to add any thoughts about research?
Yeah, just before I go there, I'd maybe also like to just talk a little bit about coming from a science teaching background into the space where I had been frustrated myself by all of the opposite issues with science, which was incredibly academic, and the pathways were all there and very strict, and trying to sort of make that meaningful for students was actually really difficult. So when I came to Waikato to do my master's, it was in science education until I did the course with Alister, which he was running, where he came and did a section on technology education as part of a science education paper. And that just completely blew my mind. I just thought, this is exactly what I want to be doing. It's technology, not science. The constraints of science and how it didn't give kids agency was just, you know, all of that potential was in this new thing that we could do, where we were talking about a genuinely different way of seeing the world and intervening in that world in a way rather than just following the rules and being a part of it. So that background was really important to see how I think a lot of the science education at that time was really failing our kids, wasn't giving them opportunities to think critically, creatively. So yeah, coming into technology, I personally have never taught technology in the classroom. I have always been a part of technology through a researcher and professional development lens. But I've always remembered that, and just watching kids, to your point, David, just watching kids in our amazing research teachers' classrooms doing things which in my lifetime I never thought would have happened. And that was really about bringing everything back together, bringing in the materials understanding, where science was one of many knowledge bases that came together to support decision making. And that was so exciting, that agency that those kids have, the sense of I can actually make a difference in the world. And particularly, a lot of the research schools that I was working in were lower socioeconomic areas, and particularly the difference that it made to those kids, where they would bring in those days, we didn't even know a lot about Mātauranga, but they were bringing it in. They were bringing in their understandings from their whānau, and we would often have a lot of their kuia and matua come into classrooms to work with them and talk about the importance of some of the design ideas in their work in terms of whakapapa. I mean, that was just, again, mind-blowing. The sorts of thinking and criticality that they were bringing to what they were doing, even as young as 5-year-olds, and seeing that and having them being able to talk to us about why they were doing things. Just amazing. Incredible. And TENZ was really important, I think, in bringing people from a range of different backgrounds together. And also in the beginning, and I'm like you've already said, Alister and Welby, I'm not involved in TENZ anymore, so I don't quite know what it looks like anymore. But in the early days, we had members that were from industry as well as practicing teachers. And that was really key as well, because we had that direct linking into your local community who was working there. Kids were doing meaningful things with their community and businesses in ways that, again, were almost frowned upon in other subjects in school. But we were just like, yeah, no, bring it on. This is great. This is exactly what we need, is that connection into community, connection into doing what we really have meaning for those kids. So, yeah, just definitely the best part of my career has been in this area. I miss it a lot.
I think what people have highlighted, we had a bit of a social license to go and do what we wanted to do that I don't know if is around now. So the 80s, I don't want to go back and say how great the 90s were, because that's sort of, there's a few memes around that. But, science, 88 was looking at doing things differently. You had workshop technology, 86. And then I think we had political license a little bit from, with the curriculum reforms. Someone like Lockwood Smith gave us permission to go and do what we wanted to do, because he recognised, after conversations with Paul Black and myself in London, that we had to do things differently in New Zealand. We couldn't pick up a curriculum from overseas, which was what was going to happen. So in 1990, there was quite a strong debate in New Zealand, should we just pick up overseas curriculum from Australia and the UK? Well, no, England and Wales it should be. But, and I think he was dissuaded of that, which then gave us the license to try and bring together a broader coalition. So I think, if we had continued down our subject norms, we probably wouldn't have had TENZ. And the only way we could actually create a new subject was actually to have create an association which was going to do things differently and bring things together. So, we didn't mind if people came from het hands, if they came from industry, because we were on a particular path. But I do think that was a unique time. And I think some of the people on the call today were people who were striving and trying to build change. And unless we'd had that energy, then I don't think we would have been able to achieve what has been achieved. And what I think we wanted to also create something, I think, Welby, Cliff and Vicki, that was enduring. And we had to put systems in place in those beginning days. So the facilitator training in 95 was actually really important, because we started building cohorts, and we brought industry in to teach some of that. So that created those industry links. They went down to schools. And so we created this model to have a ripple effect across the country, and we could use some of that money to set up TENZ. And I think that first conference we had in Christchurch with 400 people coming and using global connections. So we weren't just trying to do things locally. We were also thinking globally as well as what was happening at the local school. So it was much more of a systems approach to try to create an inclusive and organisation that was going to do things differently and would be sustainable. So what structures did we have to put in to make it sustainable? Hence the trust. So it became enduring beyond. We saw too many associations blowing up because of an executive that didn't get on. You had to put resource in to create an executive officer. So you had to get support from the Royal Society, from Engineering New Zealand. So building coalition in the early 90s and really to the early 2000s was absolutely important, and getting key advocates both politically and in the schooling sector and from organisations was important. If we hadn't done that, I don't think we would be seeing out 30 years.
And I think you're absolutely right, Alister. I mean, that support that came in from industry, both to support us inside the classroom, but also support us as an organisation and politically, to put their weight behind the importance of technology and technology developing for the benefit of kids, I think was really important. I think the other one that really came through was that money that came in that Steve Benson, and I'm just trying to remember what the ministry was at the time that gifted the money.
Growth and Innovation Fund. It came from
yeah.
MB.
Yeah, from MB, yeah. That was
in a previous iteration.
Yeah.
But I mean, that opened up the opportunity to really do some in-depth research inside classrooms to see what could be achieved, and opened up projects like the Beacon Practice Project, and it also opened up the opportunity to support teachers with that ongoing professional development that came away from that as well. And I think that was really important as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, we had an opportunity around professional development we don't have now, and how we use that to create the association and the coalescing of those funds. But anyway, Welby had his hand up, so
it's actually if just drawing some of those threads together, when the two or three points that there was, what TENZ has at its heart is an understanding that people at the coalface can work together to do the job. They can work together to build things. And so it's a very community-based approach where you trust the embedded professionals. You don't centralize and alienate and then pass policy and tell people to do something. You draw people together. That if you look down that little panel of people sitting there, you can actually see a wonderful illustration of how diverse TENZ was. You get somebody who's a film director working in television, you get someone who's a scientist, you get somebody who's teaching drawing and design, you get somebody, so very, very diverse people. And they actually, so what it does is it pooled skills, and most of those people had some leverage out or some piece of their world that reached out into the commercial sector. And so what you got was two things coming together. You got a long history of child-centered or student-centered learning, which came from a deeply humanist education system, which came out of the 1940s in New Zealand. So some of our leaders, Murray Clay, Sylvia Ashton Warner, Elwyn Richardson, these were people who put the child at the center, put the student at the center. So design put the student thinker at the center. And then you resource that. Then you had to build good structures around it. And you built those structures by using people who were involved in stuff. But you pulled in researchers, you consulted, you didn't just put something to a little group and then hand down the policy and go, well, that's what you do. You actually built it organically from inside that world. And it was I'm not trying to be too euphoric about it, but the truth was that we were a mixed bag, a wonderfully mixed bag. And that mixed bag was what technology required, because it accepted that it was standing at the vanguard. It was at the face of change. It didn't have a set world with set knowledge. It had a world that was going to constantly change. And so it had to have people who could move dexterously. And Alister, you absolutely nailed it, that one of the wonderful things that happened was that as a nation, we had sufficient courage to trust ourselves to build a curriculum for ourselves, and trust ourselves to build the support, to build TENZ, to build the organization, and not have it centrally managed, have good communication, but actually go trust the professionals involved in this and watch what's happening and read it from there, and then build that world. And so we are in truth, if you're watching this, it's not a group of old people going, oh, it was much better back then, because it wasn't. It was also really tough. You really had to struggle, But education lies with us. We endure any government. We endure any individual. Collectively, we endure because we live in the world of developing thought. Just as with each generation of teachers and each generation of students who come through, that's where the power for change lies. And TENZ is a really good example of something incredibly productive that came out of that understanding. But it had imported the knowledge of people who knew systems. So some of these people, where you see their rooms behind you, what you don't see is their cunning is, they're very skilled. They're very skilled at making things work, at making good linkages between things, so that there was, beyond the vision, there was strength and strategy and care and the ability to listen closely to what was happening on the ground, and not to just wheel policy in over the top of it. And that's something to be very proud of.
Yeah, I agree, Welby. I think that notion of care was so important, because it was really hard, and there were a lot of people, including a lot of teachers, that thought we were doing something really terrible to their subjects. No matter what angle they were coming from, we were getting it from all sides. And we just really cared about each other, and we were pretty tight. And I think that continues on, like even all of these years later. And I think about the number of people that were in those first two, the facilitator training cohorts. Those people, a number of those people are still very close friends of mine. We developed something that was so much more than a course. It was a way of thinking, a way of being in the world, which had at its center social and ethical and environmental care. And I've never found that anywhere else. That was great.
I think the other part that goes with it is we also challenged one another too. I mean, there was some pretty robust debates at times about direction and where things were going. But again, I think that was for the good of the profession, but also the good of the curriculum. But at all times, I think we all kept the kids at the centre, the learner at the centre. Always, it was always what opportunities we would be giving these kids to demonstrate their abilities.
And the diversity of them. Yeah.
Really, I still, after, I just turned 70 a couple of weeks ago. So, I'm supposed to be the hell out of here, but I deeply committed to, I love the world of thought, but I still look back, the very best professional development I ever had anywhere and I started teaching at 19. So in over 50 years, was a small window when we were moving forward initially and said, maybe the professional development should be done by the people who are finding their way inside this. And we would travel between each other's schools to be the examination panels of work. And what we got was the work was not stripped of its context. You walked in and you saw the school, you saw the facilities, you saw that world, and we were building strength from within. We understood graphically how diverse New Zealand education is, that between two schools 40k away can be the world of difference in resourcing. And we understood what it was when they could afford very, very little, but they had great catalysts there. We could see what happens when you got bad teaching. You could see what happens when you've got great support. And so we were not just helping to understand the nature of standards in this kind of thinking. We were understanding the world of New Zealand education in a way that nothing else in my career has ever enabled me to do. And I know it was seen as expensive, but I still look back at it and go, it was a very rich investment. And it caused a huge amount, it dissolved a lot of ideological table banging, because you realized how diverse our country is and how something has to be flexible enough to adjust to that. And I'm still, the people who are involved in getting the agency for that kind of professional development through, I have immense respect for and immense gratitude for what they did, because it was just like being put in a hothouse of growth.
I think also too, because I agree, Welby. I think it was a unique time in the sense that there was, I think you talked about it at the beginning, we were ready for a change, whether it was from science, whether it was from workshop, whether it was from the old tech drawing, whatever it was, we were up for a change. And I think what technology education did at the time, and the way we were fortunate enough to approach it the way we did, was there was a sense of energy of people who were still wanting to really push that change. And so, yes, you could challenge, yes, nobody had the right answer, but what we tried to do was to take those views into account. And I think I was lucky enough to travel around the country in 92 and meet those groups and speak to those groups to realize that we actually had far more in common than we had difference. And I think that was the power of what was occurring at that time. That actually, I think, was a unique time when we weren't running back to our subcultures as much as we might do now, and weren't being as protective. There was a group that weren't as protective. And I think that created an incredibly unique opportunity. And there was an openness to consider new ways of doing things as well. But we also had a national strategy, and I think David alluded to that. We suddenly had a television program where I'm filling my car up on a Saturday morning, and the petrol attendant, as we used to have in those days, wanted to talk about what was on educational TV at some ungodly hour on a Saturday morning. So we did have restricted communication then as we compared with now, but we actually had, I think, some advocates that saw change. And if you're going to think about educational change, what were those levers that we needed to deploy, rather than reverting back to our sort of corners and trying to fight it out from there? So it was unique in that way. And I think some of the people on the call today were those people who could think differently, and weren't stuck in what had been done in the past, and put learning at the centre. When you've got that, then you can get some real change. But I'm just excited that 30 years later, we still have TENZ. I mean, I think that's, and it's continuing on that journey. That to me is, that is huge, because I've seen professional organisations come and go. And I think it goes back to some of those foundations and the people on the call.
I think the other thing, Welby's just reminded me about the importance of what we saw when we did go around the schools. And you could resource the school with all the physical equipment and rooming that was required in order to teach the subject of technology. But at the end of the day, it was teach professional development that made the biggest change. And I think it was, the facilitator program that you and Vicki ran, Alister, was a big part of that. But what followed on behind that was the ongoing professional development of teachers, so that they saw the opportunities to open up the opportunities for their kids in their classrooms, and allow them to be those critical thinkers and create the environment which enabled them to be able to do that. And I don't think we could ever underestimate the importance of the work that was done with teachers right across by all of us, in terms of supporting teachers to understand and putting examples of good practice, or what was not at that time as we knew it, but examples of practice which changed their own classroom practice and their own pedagogies that they use to deliver the subject.
And on that professional development notion, I think one of the things that I really remember is that but because TENZ was very much an open community, and the researchers and the teachers and teacher educators and industry all there and together, that just also supported a very research informed, but also I don't know quite how to put it, but like all of the research that I was involved in was as much a learning experience for me as it was for the teachers. It was just like fantastic. In today's language, you'd talk about it as co-innovation. We weren't really probably talking that much about that in those days, but that's exactly what it was. We were coming in with a research perspective, with a teacher's perspective, with what's possible in the classroom, opening up doors that we didn't, one side wouldn't have thought possible. And the students as well being involved in that partnership. So the students, the teachers, the researchers, all learning from each other, all partnering to do something that was better than any of us individually could have thought possible. And those are very powerful views to be bringing together, I think, and created world leading. I still believe our technology curriculum was world leading. We had many comments to that effect in the international community. And I remember Mark de Vries, when he came over for the Napier conference, making that point that the three legs of the stool were very clearly in place for us in terms of the research, the teaching, and the professional development, all working in unison. Where any TENZ conference had none of this. Teachers are coming to learn from the experts what to do. It was very much like everybody's coming together to move the whole community further ahead through conversation. Very, very powerful modelling.
I think it's a good point, Vicki, and one we probably didn't talk about at the beginning, but it was quite deliberate, and I'd forgotten this, but we didn't call it the Technology Teachers Association. We didn't call it New Zealand, Education Technology Educators Research Association. It was deliberate to call it Technology Education New Zealand because when we looked globally, it had to have research, it had to have teachers, it had to have people from early childhood, it had to have people from industry. And so signing those up and having Engineering New Zealand and other professional organisations supporting us was actually really important. It had the teacher at the core, but it wasn't going to be defined by a name, which would then be exclusive to other groups.
That's an interesting point, because if you turn the mirror, you also saw it on the, many secondary schools in the 80s and 90s, still today, are Prussian states, disciplinary Prussian states, and they're allies or at war, and with a lot of passive aggression going on. And that's just what the world of education is. But one of the really interesting things was that technology, because it hadn't grown inside the culture of an established discipline, it meant that in some schools, lines between disciplines were dissolving. So suddenly, if you were working in fabric technology, you were wanting to look at fabrications and working with fabrics that no longer didn't sit in the sewing room or didn't sit in the, you were marketing, you were developing packaging for kiwi fruit. You needed to be able to cross the borders to do it. And the schools that I remember seeing amazing stuff happen was where there were amazing relationships happening that were dissolving disciplines. But it was, Vicki, you said before something which was so true. It wasn't all a bed of roses. Some people found themselves very threatened. They're going, well, why are you doing that? That's out. And you go, why are you dropping an egg out the window in a box? Because that doesn't belong to you. Or why are you making a video? Because that belongs to us. And you go, it belongs to thought. And, wouldn't we all be grateful to be reinforcing each other's bodies of knowledge? But it was such a strange phenomenon, because here came this thing that did not have a disciplinary root. And it even knew from the beginning, if you go back to, the early 80s, the 85 discussion of, is technology belong to science? Does it belong to here? Does it belong to here? Does it belong to the environment? Does it belong to social order? Where does it belong? And it found a home in the ability to work between and across disciplines communities and wider connections between business and school. And so it was a very unusual thing. And I can understand why TENZ has endured, because I think that was way back in the day before we even realized how significant it was. When you look at it today, I'll give you an example. So there was a lot of stuff that happened that we didn't realize how radical that was. So the idea that you would start looking at products in terms of their impact on the environment was very early inside technology education, very early, and about wastage of materials. Now, you know, it's a huge thing, but we're talking in the 1980s and early 90s, and kids designing were going, so what happens when that breaks? Where does that end up? And what's the cost of using that material or that solution to that? You know, what's going to happen after the floodlight's gone off the stage and you're left there with the empty set? What's the cost of that set? And so all that thing about the social, making the border, the shift between the demarcation between the social consequence of something and the technological development of it and pushing that together. And now we live in a world where we see those things not working. We understand the impact is dire, really dire. And yet you can see the seeds of that coming right through New Zealand education inside. And that stuff was being talked about at TENZ. That stuff at those conferences, we had people bringing in examples or talking about that wider dimension of something, because this wasn't something constrained by a culture of a fixed discipline.
Oh my gosh, I have just been sitting here not wanting to say anything because I just have to say ka mihi kia koutou. The way that you feel so passionate about what you've talked about, the richness of your connections and your experiences has just been so great. When I think about what I was going to say and ask, it just keeps, you were answering questions before they were even being asked. I just want to kind of try and paraphrase, and I'm not ever going to do it as well as you, but we've talked a lot about how TENZ came about, its identity and purpose, the impact it has had on you and the learners and the communities of schools and industry and other things that you've been a part of. And then we've kind of talked about PLD and the richness of how we've talked about the longevity of TENZ and ensuring that. And then you've also touched on community and culture within the kaiako mā, or the teachers and the industry and the pupils of our schools and things. So I think if I was to summarise, the things that touched me were the way you talked about agency that you have, but also agency that your pupils were able to bring to this innovative change that was happening. And I know you talked about right back in the 1940s and how that has led you through. I listen to those dates and I think, where was I within my education and my thinking at those times too? So hopefully one day I'll be able to do that. I loved the diversity of thinking about the whole person, the learner at the centre, that there is that co-innovation of the students, the teachers and the researchers, which I think is probably the secret sauce of TENZ, because of the wonderful mahi that was done right back at the start when you had that raru, you had those conversations about what that you agreed to disagree and find what worked and think beyond something that was controlled by somebody else, that was built from within, that was purpose built for our country, and that I think is something really special. I think the other things that I heard you talking about were that ability to trust and endure, and again the unity that that shared vision you were creating brought to technology. And then you also brought in it with the richness of conversation, all of that social and ethical and environmental things that you did, that you have been part of, and as part of what you believe and teach and encourage, let alone the ability to design. So I hope that we can do service to what you have laid before us and over the next 30 years. So, and beyond, hopefully. So is there anything that you would like to add more about that, or we're just mindful that we're happy to stay and chat, but if somebody has somewhere they have to be, we're mindful of that too. So does anyone want to add anything else?
Just one wee thing.
Please, please.
We are lucky to have you. We are lucky to have every generation who comes through. And it always seems to me that, in any group of people who we worked with, we knew that there was a generation coming through and that we also stood on the shoulders of giants. And they may not have been well acknowledged. We may have had to go and hunt them out, but each of us do. And the fact that I think it's a hugely important thing that TENZ is an example of something that stayed standing through so many ideological shifts. And if you examine its roots were about respect for difference. And the fact that difference can coexist, but that you resource it with strategists. You resource it with strategists who understand the importance of that. And now it's really important that those things are there. But we also know that there are amazing educators and amazing young minds coming through in this incredible country who, despite some assumptions to another view, knows itself very well, is unique, knows that. And in that lies our strength. At the school that I got expelled from when I was 15, the motto on the wall said kia kaha, and it means not just be strong, but ever be strong. And I still think that was the most valuable thing that Te Awamutu College ever gave me. And I think it's probably the only thing I think it ever did give me, that we have to stand with strength. We have to stand with strength and hope and optimism and belief, and also import strategy in to help, because none of us has the whole answer on our own. So when you look up that wee panel on the side of your screen, that's a very odd collection of people connected by a common belief in something. And that's why we stand, and that's why the future will go on, because those squares will be populated with other people. So thank you. And thank you for organizing this. It was a really great idea. It was lovely to catch up with my mates.
Yes.
Old mates now.
Oh, thank you.
No, thanks, Ruth, for organising it, because it is actually quite good to get together, because it actually takes a collection of people to remember what occurred, because we've all got different perspectives. So really appreciate you getting us together. Otherwise, you get a sort of a bland analytical or a really enthusiastic a perception of what occurred. But to have the multiple voices, that's where TENZ came from, and to have it here today is actually great to have those multiple voices, because we could not have achieved what we achieved without listening to those voices, taking account of those, and what would make a difference for learners, because that was always, it wasn't about us, it wasn't about a curriculum, it wasn't about, I've chucked it all out now, so that's all good. It's disappeared in the archives of the university, so that's fantastic. But I think it lives on in the next generation and the next generation after that. So really thanks to getting us together, and thanks for the opportunity to see my friends again, because and to reminisce on those times, because they were good times, they were hard times, and we got a lot of flack. It wasn't plain sailing, and there was a lot of critique that was going on, both in the media and from other parts of the teaching and education sector as well. So it wasn't straightforward, but it was a great time to drive some change.
It was, and you did a great job, Lisa.
Oh,
Nice pulling together of the main points. It
I
almost
thought, how
sounded
many
like we
pieces
were
of
quite
paper?
quite coherent.
No, you were very, like I said, it was just too rich to want to interrupt. It was just so lovely. You can see that connection that you've had, and that friendship, and that shared vision. Even now, you're saying thank you to your friends and coming together. Well, we've just felt like it's been such a privilege to hear your stories and capture your memories. And when we sit on the TENZ you know, we will carry that and hold that in our hearts as we move forward too. So thank you, thank you, thank you. If no one else has got anything to say, should we finish, Ruth?
Yep, we can close off. I am obviously, you know, katoa tōku inga kupu kua kōrero here. I acknowledge it's always warm and fuzzy at the end of something like this. So thank you. It is all of us that made this happen. And I'll hand over for Lisa to do our closing karakia.
Kia ora, Ruth. Just before I finish with closing karakia, I would just like to say thank you for choosing the name so wisely for TENZ, to have something that is built between and across. And I would like to just say before I do karakia, the comment kia kaha, it made me think of adding kia kaha ake ake ake. So forever we need to be strong. So thank you so much. I will just try and make this a little bit bigger. And right, so kia mātou katoa kua mutu mātou i a mātou mahi, i a mātou kaupapa hoki, arahina mātou, kia kawi mātou i a mātou haipapa, kia whakatapua mātou ki ngā kaupapa me ngā mea e whakapono. Manaki tia mai mātou. So thank you once again for helping us continue with TENZ and build on what you've laid before us. And we are definitely dedicated to the things we do and believe as being part of TENZ. So thank you, thank you, thank you.